You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm excited. We're going to be learning about miniatures, which is kind of an area outside my expertise, but my guest literally wrote the book on the subject. Kathleen Langone wrote The Miniature Painter Revealed, Amalia Kussner's Gilded Age Pursuit of Fame and Fortune. Thank you so much for coming to join me.
Well, Kyle, I'm delighted to be on your series, and I truly enjoy telling the public about Amalia Kussner.
So I'm excited because, I'm going to be honest, acknowledge my priors. I was really big into Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, modern abstract movements, and miniature paintings and stuff like that. It was not an area I dove too much into in my art history studies and stuff like that. I'm curious, what made Amalia Kussner stand out to you? What made her so interesting that you wanted to pursue even like writing this book?
Well, there are two things. First of all, I will tell you folks that I'm related to her. I'm a very distant cousin. And I knew about Amalia growing up. When I was a little girl, my grandmother had one of those beautiful gold curio cabinets that had many family curiosities in it. And she had 3 miniatures done by Amalia Kussner. And I said to my grandmother, who is this woman? Why do you have her miniatures? And my grandmother told me 2 things. She said, well, she was an artist in Indiana. And, she is related through your grandfather's side of the family. She did go to London, England, and she painted the Prince of Wales. Now, at this time, the Prince of Wales was only a few years away from becoming Edward VII. And then my grandmother said, by the way, the Prince of Wales was sweet on Amalia and actually gave her a piece of jewelry. And as a little girl, I saw this piece of jewelry. It was a gorgeous emerald pendant, suspended in a diamond-encrusted triangle. And since, unfortunately, the piece has been sold, but it was a very tantalizing mystery to me. But that's all she told me about Amalia. So all that I thought was that this woman lived in Indiana. She did miniatures, took one trip over to do the Prince, and then came back, and that was it.
It's interesting because it's kind of a romantic story. I mean, this woman from the Midwest going off to England and meeting the royals and all of that. See, this is why I love talking to someone who knows the history, because me being the outside ignorant observer, I'm just like, it's a bunch of small stuff. I don't get it. But like, this is kind of also why I do the show, because there's always a rich story behind these artists, and that's where it becomes really fascinating to me. So can you tell me a bit of Amalia, I guess a bit more of Amalia's life story and her journey?
Oh, certainly. And I think you've got a good point. As much as her miniatures were beautifully done, I mean, to me, her life story is really the bigger story here, if you will. So Amalia grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana, maybe not too small of a city, west of Indianapolis, actually on the Indiana-Illinois border. And she showed artistic talent at a young age. And her parents really fostered that talent and sent her to a local girls' Catholic school called St. Mary in the Woods Academy. And a nun there that was very fortunate for Amalia herself was trained in art sketches and painting and that sort of thing, and took Amalia under her wing. So Amalia got some very steady art instruction as a young lady. And then she got more art lessons in high school. And then again, her parents being so supportive, sent her out to what I will call a New York City finishing school. You're supposed to learn foreign languages, the graces to be a young lady in society, but also Amalia got further art lessons. This would have been in New York City around 1882. Then when Amalia went back to Terre Haute, she had pretty much decided that miniatures would be her artwork. And just to give you a history perspective on where miniatures were in this country at this time, miniatures were very popular during the colonial era and up through the Civil War. Then, with the advent of photography, a lot of people, especially well to do people, wanted to have photographs of their relatives. But they saw with time, of course, the photographs were black and white, and people were very stiff in the photographs done of them. And there was a revival of the miniature art form that actually started in Paris, France in 1890. And then Amalia found out about this. Of course, she'd already decided miniatures would be her artwork, but she just put all of her efforts and energies into doing miniatures. And I have to say, she really was the forefront to the miniature revival in the United States.
So that's interesting to me because, I always look at the advent of photography as an inflection point in art history. I've always talked about how the development of the camera. I feel like the puns are going to be just dripping from this, but I feel like, with the camera, artists started to shift their focus towards the elements that the camera couldn't capture as well. At that time it was black and white, so they focused on color and they focused on the expressive qualities as a way of competing with that technology. I'm curious, in the realm of miniatures, did we see some stylistic shifts happening in the trends at that time?
I think very much so. I think there was an emotional aspect that was given to many miniatures. So she made the women absolutely beautiful in these miniatures. And in addition to how she painted their faces, and she was incredible, in the miniatures, you could see individual strands of hair and, eyes were beautifully drawn. But her other thing, and this was really her stylistic trademark, if you will, is she wrapped women in swaths of cloth like tulle and satin and velvet. So you didn't see women in these high lace Victorian gowns and everything. Their shoulders were exposed. Very few of the miniatures, a little bit of the women's bosom was exposed. So she really made glamorous, beautiful portraits of these women. And in some cases, I would say in modern day terms, she photoshopped their looks a little bit. So if a woman was a little plump, she might have thinned her face a little bit. If a woman had very small eyes, she might have made them a little bit larger and glamorous. In fact, she did do a portrait of Mrs. Astor. This would be the famous Mrs. Astor from the Gilded Age. She did her portrait probably around 1894, and she beautified Mrs. Astor.
So that's interesting to me because now I'm thinking about like how these miniatures would be utilized, because on the one hand, as you talk about how like it's bare shoulders and stuff, and in that era, it feels like it would have been sort of pushing some boundaries and, the social norms of portraying a person, less covered up. And at the same time, if they're getting the generous edit with the painting and everything like that, the light Photoshop or the filter, if you will, in the 19th century equivalent, that feels like something to show off. So like, can you talk about how these miniatures would have been displayed or held privately? Like, can we just get a sense for like where they fit into people's lives and their collections?
Oh, sure. I mean, miniatures were certainly very different from larger portraits you might see, in people's studies or their living rooms or dining rooms. Miniatures could be a bedside item, like at a bedside table. It might have been at a dressing table in a bedroom. Even in a living room, you might have had a table of smaller, beautiful objects, maybe Venetian glass vases, things of that nature. Sometimes miniatures would be grouped with these other objects. And the thing about miniatures, too, you could travel with a miniature. If a woman had a particularly beautiful miniature that she wanted to show her friends or maybe her husband, her lover, or whatever, it could travel with her wherever she went. And I will add, sometimes Amalia did miniatures as jewelry. It could have been a pendant with a pin. There was one story I read where she did miniatures on bracelet charms that were of bridesmaids for a wedding. So there were a couple of different forms that these miniatures could be in.
Well, and now as you talked about the travel, I feel like I want to circle back to, because you hinted at, or well, you didn't really hint, you told us the connection with the royals, and I feel like I would be remiss to not dig at that story a little bit more. Can you tell us more about her royals connection?
So there were two main, I think, primary royal connections. When Amalia came to New York, and she came into New York City around 1892, she had a connection there through a friend of hers from Terre Haute, Indiana, who was a prominent actress. So, at the get-go, when she arrived in New York City, she had some connections. But then after a couple of years, people saw her artwork. She really gained in popularity, and she connected with a woman who was Minnie Paget. And Minnie Paget was one of the many dollar heiresses, or the very wealthy American women that married into British royalty, etc. Now, after Minnie saw Amalia's talent and everything, she actually brought Amalia over to London, England. Now, the first portrait she did, and this would have been in 1896, was Consuelo Vanderbilt. This is the famous daughter of Alva Vanderbilt. And at this point, Consuelo was already in the forced marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, and she arrives at Blenheim Palace, which was the home estate of the Duke. And Amalia's there soon thereafter to paint her portrait. And from my research, I think this was the first portrait done of Consuelo as she became the Duchess of Marlborough. There'd be later portraits done. I think John Singer Sargent did one, but Amalia was the first. So that was the first prominent royal. But now let's talk about the Prince of Wales. So a year later, and by this time, Amalia's become even more popular in British society, not just New York, but over in London. And Minnie Paget, who was friends with the royal family, she had a lot of royal connections, I think told the Prince of Wales about Amalia. And he said, well, why don't we have her do my miniature? So Amalia went to Marlborough House and painted Prince Edward. Again, the timing here, he was only 4 years away from becoming the king with the death of Queen Victoria. But she painted him there. Not only did she paint him, she did something very unusual. She said, I want to paint you alone. I don't want anybody else in the room. I don't want any of your assistants or those bringing you any news of the day. I want you to have all my attention to paint you. And he agreed to this. And I think she painted him in 3 or 4 settings. And again, like we mentioned, she beautified his face a little bit. She thinned it out a little bit. He was a bit of a portly man, a handsome man, but portly. And then actually the third, I think, famous set of royals that she painted in 1899. And again, I think through connections with Minnie Paget, she got an invitation to go to St. Petersburg. First to paint the aunt of Tsar Nicholas II. And then shortly after she meets with this aunt, she doesn't even get a chance to paint her. A messenger from the Winter Palace, from the Tsar, shows up at this aunt's house and says, no, Amalia, you need to come to the Winter Palace right now, and you're going to paint Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra. And that, to me, is one of the most dramatic stories of people she interacted with. She was with the family off and on for 3 to 4 weeks. She actually became friends with Tsarina Alexandra. They was traditionally very shy, and even gave gifts to her daughter at this point, gave gifts to her 2 daughters. At this point, there were 2 daughters. It was Tatiana and Olga. So that alone, to me, made Amalia's life so fascinating, those stories.
It's interesting that she went from, England to get the Tsar and Tsarina as well. And I cannot imagine, I can't imagine telling a royal, like, I want to paint you, but come alone,
Exactly. She was so
I can't
bold.
imagine the boldness to sort of feel like you can call some shots in there and say it's going to happen under my circumstances.
It's my way or the highway, basically.
Which, I mean, good on her. You got to have confidence and to be assertive, but that clearly worked pretty well for her. I mean, we're talking about her and her work. What is this, 130 years later? Because she was 1890s, give or take. And now, after a short break, I think we should talk a little bit more about that specific work. This week, I'm talking to Kathleen Langone, the author of a new book, The Miniature Painter Revealed. It's a book about Amalia Kussner, who was a painter of miniatures. And, you know, for listeners interested in learning more, check the links in the show notes. I'll put links, or just go to your favorite bookseller. The book's on the shelves right now. But I always feel like to get to know an artist, we gotta get to know their work. And so I asked you in preparation for this if you would pick out a favorite work or two, you know, something that has a good story behind it. So can you tell us what's the work that was the standout to you?
So one of her works is not actually a miniature, but I think it's one of her most beautiful and unusual works. Back in Victorian time, because a lot of people, of course, had fireplaces, sometimes there would be painted decorative tiles above or on the mantle of a fireplace to decorate it. And Amalia had an aunt in Terre Haute, Indiana, and painted on 3 Minton tiles. Minton tiles were a very good quality tile that came out of England. And what she painted, I have come to call Moon Lady. So across these 3 tiles, you have this woman wrapped in diaphanous, sort of revealing fabric, and she's actually arched over a crescent moon. It's really a very sensuous depiction. It is the only painting I ever found of Amalia's that was a full figure of a woman. But it's just beautiful. And I had seen this painting, again, when I was a little girl at my grandmother's. I thought it was an illustration out of a children's book. And I thought, oh, I'd love to read that children's book. This is such a beautiful lady, you know, draped over this crescent moon. And I found out about 6 years ago, it was actually done by Amalia. This would have been just before she went to New York City. And there are a couple of standout things. First of all, I think it's a very sensuous painting. As this woman is like draped over the crescent moon, there's sort of a look of ecstasy on her face. Again, she's sort of exposed, her bosom is exposed. And then sort of similar to some of her miniatures, there's this gorgeous draped fabric around her that's sort of floating in the air, sort of looking like a Baroque masterpiece. A lot of the Baroque paintings would have, you know, floating fabric in the back. And if you look at it, and I've looked at it a lot more recently, even the delicate hand. So this woman, as she's draped over the crescent moon, she has a hand behind her head, and you see the individual fingers so beautifully drawn. So even though this is not a miniature, you could see her ability to do very finely drawn artwork. And again, you can see the strands of hair. It's just a stunning, stunning painting, even though it's over 3 tiles.
Well, and it's interesting to me. It's very stark contrast. It has, you know, almost a graphic feel to it where, like, you know, maybe it's just my old man eyes and my cataracts, but like from a distance, I just see this silhouette that's interesting and unusual because, you know, her skin tone is so sort of pale that it blends in quite a bit with the fabric, but then we can see on closer inspection all the little details. Like we see the wrinkles in the fabric, the slight shadows that give that translucency of like the knee bent pushing through the fabric that's wrapped around her. And you're right, there is this quality about like it feels like it could have been an illustration from like not quite a Grimm's book or something like that, but there's this mythological feel to it, right? Like
that's a good way to put it, because she would have been too pretty, I think, for a Grimm's fairy tale.
Yeah. Yeah, but there is something sort of fantasy or otherworldly about it. Like it feels like, you know, if you told me this was a representation of like a Venus or an Aphrodite or some other figure from mythology, I would buy it. You know, if you told me this was a representation of a moon goddess, yeah, sure. Because of the way that she's laying out across the moon, and there's no context. I mean, yeah, we see the crescent moon shape, but it's a black, you know, stark background, and so she's and because it's just this plain fabric wrapped around her too, that sort of sets it apart, because we don't have markers of fashion which would tie it to a specific time or a culture.
Not
right.
really.
She's standing outside of that.
Exactly right. I mean, it makes me think a little bit of Baroque paintings, but I think you made a good analogy, like some sort of Grecian or Roman moon goddess.
Yeah. Um, and it's interesting work, and to the scale on this and these works, like it's very detailed for such a small work. I know this isn't like her true like miniature, um, but there's really such fine detail
And
in
I want
there.
to add, there was one of the miniatures that she did when she was in St. Petersburg, that aunt to Tsar Nicholas II, when she did her miniature, she did have fabric floating out behind her. So there were a few miniatures that had this sort of floating fabric that gave it a very mythical feel.
So was that a deliberate choice of hers? Like, what? I mean, you've kind of mentioned that was sort of her style, and like when I'm looking at this, the other photo, the Duchess of Marlborough. Um, there's this gauzy sort of fabric wrapped around her. Um, it seems to have been a stylistic choice or a signature move of hers to wrap people in this fabric. But I'm curious, what was the reason behind that? Did she talk at all about why she would do that, or is it just for us to sort of speculate about the aesthetics and the connections?
I mean, I think it is for us to speculate, but I will say that I have read that she might have studied Baroque painting. So to me, there's very, very much a Baroque feel to it, this very sort of opulent fantasy feel. So, and I have seen, paintings, other Baroque paintings, again with the floating fabric and the folds and all of that. I think it's very Baroque era. And getting back to, the revival of miniature painting at this time, it was a tremendous breakaway from these very staid miniatures you might see you've done in America, let's say in 1830. So these were, again, beautiful mystical paintings.
Yeah. And as I'm looking at it now, as I'm shifting my attention to the I'm looking at the Duchess of Marlborough.
Mhm.
Um, it's interesting how with this one too, even though it's a known figure, it is grounded in time. There's a realistic expression. There's still this softness to it, the way that she sort of dissolves into the space. And partially that's because it's, in monochrome, it's all, black, white, and gray. And so that unifies everything. It becomes this soft sort of vignette and everything. But the gauzy fabric, I think, is really interesting in here. What was the purpose of this particular miniature piece? Was this one that like went on a piece of jewelry? Was this one like in a locket? Was this one for to be displayed? Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it was to be displayed, and there were a number of magazine articles written about this miniature that Amalia did of the Duchess of Marlborough, and it was even documented that the Duke at that time was so enamored with the miniature that he ordered two or three more to be done. And one of the things that you could see in the book is if you look at a photo of Consuelo Vanderbilt, I think Amalia really captured the beautiful swan like neck, her lovely, delicate profile. So there's a realism to what this woman looked like, and then again, layered with the sort of mythical wrap of fabric.
Hmm. It's almost like kind of reminds me of like Lisbeth Vigée Lebrun, who was the portrait painter for Marie Antoinette, but
Oh,
also known for giving these royal sitters and the people in the aristocracy uh, a realistic but the best version of themselves. You know what I'm saying? And so it's interesting. This would have been, you said this was also like not just for her and for his the um, personal consumption, but also published in magazines.
oh, it was right.
Yeah.
And then, the strange thing of it is, this is something I continue to research. Where are these miniatures now? I actually contacted a very nice woman who was an archivist at Blenheim Palace, and they have no record or whereabouts of where this or maybe other miniatures would have gone of Consuelo. So it's odd. So many of these are missing now, and thank God that they were documented in magazines, so we know they really happened.
Oh, that is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So these pieces were lost, but obviously we have. I mean, I guess it's nice that we at least have the photographs to have some idea of what the work looked like. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess the 20th century, a lot of art got lost along the way in that. Now, after one last short break, I wanna talk a little bit more about your book. Welcome back. My guest this week, Kathleen Langone. You wrote this book, The Miniature Painter Revealed. Listeners, if you want to pick up a copy, head to your local bookstore or, check the links in the show notes. But I want to ask you, what are you hoping that the reader will take away from this? Aside from the fact that, obviously, Amalia Kussner was a talented artist, and maybe we've gotten to, there was a little bit of gossip with the royals and all of that, her hobnobbing with the wealthy elites of the 19th century. But like, what are you hoping the reader will see and appreciate and take away from this story? What makes it feel relevant today?
I think that aside from her astounding artwork, because she was certainly a very talented artist, she was a very complex person. We talked in the earlier segments, she was very good at promoting herself. She was fearless. She traveled all over the world, like, for example, to St. Petersburg, Russia, to do these portraits. But she had some lies, if you will, about her life. Soon after she arrived to New York City, she lied about her age by 10 years. When she arrived there, she was around 31 and she said she was 21. And then later she had a very mysterious marriage. It might have been one of those marriages of convenience to be able to advance further in society. She had a very mysterious lawsuit against her in 1901 that we still don't know the contents of. Basically, they were sealed records. But who really was she as a person? Because the more I would read about, the magazine articles and newspaper articles of the many famous people she painted, I think she became friends with some of them. I mean, certainly some of these women high in society, like Mrs. Astor from New York, could help propel her artwork. But I think some people she genuinely became friends with, like Tsarina Alexandra. But really, I think she was a different person on different days. There were some days I think she was a ruthless social climber. There were some times when, again, she'd stay in touch with some of the women she painted for years. They became friends. It's documented she was very dedicated to her family, to her mother, father. She also had an older sister and brother. But her marriage to me was in question. I'm not sure if she ever loved the man she married in July of 1900. She was such a complex person. In terms of relevance today, maybe we think of social media and how people portray themselves in social media, and you really don't know who they are. I don't know if we'll ever know who Amalia was, but I love to hear back from readers that read the full book and maybe tell me who you think she was.
Every little bit, there's just more dropped that sounds so intriguing about this woman's life. And I'm curious now, as you obviously in writing the book, you're doing a lot of research and everything like that, but you've also mentioned that she was a somewhat distant relative of yours. And I'm curious, how did that come out in the research? Were there family stories that then you were hunting down and getting verification on? Did you get some maybe insights into her as a person, from family stories and anecdotes that were passed down that, maybe weren't as easily found in the standard, art history textbooks and stuff like that. Did that connection come up in the research?
It did in a couple of instances, because I think about halfway through the book, most of my research had been, from online magazines that had been scanned in, newspapers, and there were hundreds, and I had a very good story. But one particular very distant Weinhardt cousin had letters, a few letters that she wrote. He also had a letter that her brother wrote. Now, again, getting back to Amalia's marriage, her marriage was very sudden. There was never an announced engagement. In fact, I think that her brother and father, still living in Indiana, didn't even know about this gentleman before she married him. But what was really an eye-opener to me is her brother wrote her a letter. Now we're going to fast forward to 1929. And he says in the letter, basically, I know how much your husband has loved you all these years, because every year on the anniversary, he gives you a gift. So this would have been 29 years after they initially got married. And I think this man really loved her. I think she enjoyed his company. They never had children. Again, I think marrying him advanced her in society. But, they traveled a lot. And I think that she enjoyed the life that he permitted her. But I think on his side, it was a real genuine love. But getting back to your point, it was this one very revealing letter from the brother that supported what I thought, that this was an extremely sudden marriage. I have another closer Weinhardt cousin that actually had in their holdings a note that was written by the sculptor Auguste Rodin to Amalia. Now, there's a lot of detail in there in the book as to how Amalia connected with him, and I think she actually did his miniature. But it was proof that there had been a professional relationship, if you will. And I think it was a handwritten note by Rodin to Amalia and her husband, wishing them, I think it was a happy new year, maybe like in 1906 or something. But that to me was another valuable piece of memorabilia that came through a relative.
Wow, that is an amazing connection. I always love and am so intrigued by the way that these great artists always sort of pop up in each other's stories, like it definitely feels like a lot of these towering figures from art history knew each other and hung out together in a way that seems almost implausible. Like I feel like if I saw a Hollywood rendition of, all these artists in a Paris cafe or something, I would call for a timeout and just be, but like, how could they possibly all know each other? But then as you do this research, it really does seem like a lot of them did build these personal connections. And maybe that's why they're such towering figures, is because they all supported each other. They knew each other, and they, learned and grew together, and that pushed all of them to greater heights.
And I think just to follow up on that, for the prominent artists in Europe at this time, she also connected with John Singer Sargent. She had actually supposedly given him money to do her portrait. I don't know if the portrait was ever done, but she had connections with him. So again, she did connect with a lot of the prominent artists in the 1900s in Europe.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing stuff. And if you want to read more about that stuff, you can pick up your copy of The Miniature Painter Revealed, Amalia Kussner's Gilded Age Pursuit of Fame and Fortune by Kathleen Langone. Thank you so much once again for taking the time sharing this story of this amazing artist that sadly I did not know before now, but I am excited to learn more.
Thank you so much. And I've been very impressed by your insight into the art community. Thank you for having me on.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.